Hi, it's Dr. Parikh, and we're starting on the methods section. And I've broken this up into 3 videos to make it a little easier to find exactly what you're looking for, because the methods section really has 3 different sections that are related but pretty distinct. So it's all one outline. I honestly debated switching it back to just 1 video, but it's easier at this point to just make 3 because I've got it written up everywhere as 3 videos. So the first section goes participants. So the methods section is made up of 3 sections: participants, measures, and procedures. And different articles will have slightly different sections. They might use different names, like instead of measures, it might say materials or apparatus, especially if they're working in a lab and using tools to help measure and do the study. Sometimes it's participants and procedures kind of thrown together, but this is the most standard basic setup. So first up is participants. So like most things, I've set up an outline where you just fill in what you need specifically, and then you will write it up as a draft for your peers to look over. And for each one, when you write about people, the APA has lots of guidelines about the kinds of language you use for things. So for example, you'll see some old articles will say subjects, but most new articles will say participants, because we want to recognize that these are not people we are subjecting to something. We don't get to control them. They are choosing to participate, and so we are recognizing their autonomy and the voluntary nature. They can quit at any time without penalty. That's part of ethics. And so I have put page numbers where Suchman talks about each one, and I've also talked about the APA manual. And I've done my best to come up with sort of a starting point for labels. These are some of the most likely things to change when you look at your templates, because for one, the new APA manual might have new things to say. But also, I may just learn new standards. For example, I have updated my gender labels recently because I'm trying to show you what are some of the most inclusive ones to start. So you may see these things change with time. So number of participants. So an important thing to know when you're doing this is that you are not pretending that you came up with, that you already did this study. You are not writing this up as if you have the data. You are writing this as a proposal, meaning that you're saying, I would like to do this. You have some flexibility with what you do, but I want you to do it in a serious academic way. Meaning, I don't want you to say 42 participants. I want you to pick a fairly round number. So 100, 30. So if you're doing a pretty intense intervention, you might say 30 families and have 15 in the intervention group and 15 in the non-intervention. That would be reasonable for a study. If you're just giving out a survey, I would say at least 100, because that's what would be expected to be taken seriously in the real world. More is usually better. At the same time, 10,000 I'm going to also say is unrealistic. Age of participants, and really look at the standards for how to write about age. There are particular ways you're supposed to do this. And these differences seem meaningless if you're not familiar, but it just creates this scientific environment. And when things are standardized, it's easy to read them once you learn them. So these, if you say, young adults 20 to 30 years old, I may fuss at you because the manual suggests certain ways for wording things. And I've gotten as close as I can to the way that the manual wants you to word it. For gender, if you are comparing men and women, then you are requiring people to identify as either a man or a woman. So if gender is not relevant, though, I would like to see you include at least one gender category that is not just man or woman. So I've included man, woman, transgender, non-binary, prefer not to say. That's the most, if your study is specifically about gender identity, you may end up with a dozen things that people can choose from. But for a typical study, I think this, I've given kind of a nice inclusive starting place. But if you at least have man, woman, and something else, I'm okay with it. Now, when we think about inclusion, one question is, well, why don't I just give them a box and they can choose how they want to report? The problem with that is that you get people reporting all sorts of things that are hard to know how to group together. So honestly, I would rather give people a list of things to choose from and include an option to say other, or prefer not to say, and let them choose which label is closest to them. Then later behind the scenes, me try to decide what things group together under a category. Because if I'm reporting, if I have 100 different identifications for gender, it makes it really hard for me to report that data in a meaningful way in a journal article. So for me, giving a few options is one of the best ways to balance the two. Some may be difficult. Like, actually, I just realized the way that I have the race and ethnicity is, oh, no, I do say all groups, or no. Yeah, my kid would not fit well on this race and ethnicity. At least not. So my child is we identify him as multiracial. He's too young to know how he identifies himself. And so when I fill out things like medical forms, it can be really difficult to know what to choose. For some things, I could just choose not to fill it out, and I can always choose not to fill it out. But for example, for health forms, that can be important information for his physicians to know, because some disorders, some incidence rates, some medication effectiveness can vary by race. And so it's important for some people to understand what his racial makeup is, not just in a social sense, but actually to provide better health outcomes. So when I fill out forms, it's always this conversation of, okay, what are we going to choose? Trying to collaborate with my husband, and eventually, that'll be my son's choice, what he wants put down. So yeah, I'm looking at this, and I may have written up, choose any that apply. So I might just let people pick more than one if they want. And I might do the same for gender. And so sometimes when you're reading articles, you'll see they say, the percentages do not add up to 100 because people were allowed to choose more than one category. At least 2 other demographic factors. So pick 2 things to write about, to measure. And these may be things that are related specifically to your research question. They might just be other things that you think could be relevant. So marital status, you might write that, if you're studying something dealing with relationships, you would certainly want to know marital status. And you would probably want to know more than just married or not married. So for example, I include cohabitating because that's sort of a measure of relationship, prominence, permanency, and that's not the only measure. There are lots of very committed couples who do not cohabitate, who don't live together, but it's something between single and married. Separated, divorced, widowed. So I've just given a few options. Now, if your study is about relationships, again, you might add more specific things. You might want to know, you may include time measures. So you may want to know how long the person's been in the relationship. Or you might have, dating exclusively as one of the options. So something between single and cohabitating might be in a, monogamous relationship. All of these statuses I've listed kind of assume monogamous relationships, but that is not the reality or the goal for many people. So people who are having an affair and have multiple relationships, or people who are polyamorous and they just choose to have multiple relationships that are open and that are part of their lifestyle, that, that are not hidden the way an affair might be, they would be left out too. So when you're thinking about the way that you've set up your participant section, your questionnaires, your demographic questions, always think about who's getting left out and whether that's okay or not. And whether it's okay is going to depend on the ethics of what sort of what category you're talking about. And it's also going to depend on the questions you're asking. So again, if my study focuses on relationships, I'm going to want to be much more inclusive than if this is just sort of a side thing that I'm sort of interested in knowing, but probably won't matter much. And I've also asked income level. Rather than having people write a specific number, or have, 99,000 options for them. I've just said, okay, I'm going to have it be $10,000 increments. This means that it's now groups. So if I have people report a specific number, it acts as a number. You can have twice as much as someone else. But once I have them do increments, now these are categories instead of numbers. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. When you learn more stats, you'll know that that's can be a bad thing though. So just keep in mind. And I've listed some other options for other questions you can ask about demographic factors. Recruitment. Think about how you're going to find people. If you are looking for a very specific population, think about where you would access that population. If you are studying veterans, think about where you can contact veterans. So it may be the VA, it might be veteran organizations, you might be advertising in places where a lot of your population lives. So if you're studying a specific immigrant population, you might focus on areas that have high populations for people from that part of the world. If you're looking at specific mental health concerns, you might try to advertise in therapists' offices who specialize in that. You might even try to collaborate with physicians or therapists who treat people with those disorders to see if they can sort of recommend people for the study. And talk about sort of how people, basically how will they contact you if they're interested. Typically, rather than you calling a person up, you will give an information letter. Like my daycare the other day, I got an information letter actually from someone at Caldwell doing research saying, hey, if you are, here's what we're looking for. If you would be interested, you can contact us. And it had, I think, email address, maybe phone number and name for how to contact the person if I was interested. Inclusion criteria. So if you are comparing men and women, you need to specify that people need to identify as either a man or a woman. And if it matters to you whether that is whether they identify as cisgender, so rather than transgender, someone who is cisgender is someone where their sex assigned at birth matches their gender identity. If that's important, you would specify cisgender, male or female. So just think carefully about what you want. So if you are limiting the age up here, you need to specify the age down here. With age, one thing to be clear on, it's much better if you can do the easiest is to have 18 and up, because under 18 you need to talk differently about how to get informed consent. Because under 18 you need informed consent from parents and you need assent from kids or minors. You could have a 17-year-old and you still need to get the informed consent from the parent, and you need to get informed assent. So not legal permission, but still the person saying, yes, I would like to do this study, from the 17-year-old in that case. So for most people, it's going to say 18 and up, but some people may have a specific reason to limit. I've offered examples of a lot of limitations, but with your study, don't limit it unless you have a reason to limit it. You always want to keep it as broad as you can, unless you are specifically, like if you are specifically asking about young adults, you're interested in something happening in that time of life, then yes, you would limit it to young adults. But don't limit it just to limit it. You want to keep your study as broad as possible. Incentives, it's fine to have a small incentive, whether to give each person a small amount of money, or it's also common to have some sort of drawing for money. There's also some people will donate a small amount to an organization for each person who participates. So let's say I am doing a study on cancer survivors. I might donate, for each person who takes the survey, I'll donate $1 to this cancer fund. You can choose not to have an incentive, that's fine. Just make sure you don't have an overly high incentive, because high incentives actually are problematic because they can coerce people into staying when they don't want to stay. So if someone is really hard up for cash, but this experiment or this questionnaire makes them feel really uncomfortable, but they get paid like $30 for doing it, you don't want that person to feel like they have to experience discomfort And I'm saying discomfort, but let's say you're studying trauma. This person might end up having like PTSD flashbacks that could, they may wake up in a nightmare and hurt people around them. They may have intrusive thoughts that make them call off work. Their seemingly low-risk studies can still have consequences. And so you want to make sure that you are offering an incentive low enough that if someone has reason to not want to participate, they're not going to feel like they can't walk away. Group divisions, if you are comparing two groups based on a demographic factor, so like men and women, you would explain what that is here. Or, people who have been diagnosed with depression in the past and people who haven't. If you are dividing people up like that, so on some pre-existing, so you're not randomly assigning one person to one group and another person to another group, you need to talk about ways you're going to check to see if there are other group differences. Because let's say I am comparing groups, I'm checking reading ability, and I'm comparing groups based on whether their foot size is above or below a certain cutoff. Now, it's important to recognize that people in the two groups, especially if I'm looking at minors, there's going to be other factors that are different, like age and years of education. So that's an extreme example still, but it still gives the idea that there could be other factors that are different that could explain things. And then attrition just means dropout, and you need to talk about reasons that people might drop out. If you are tracking people over time, there's always an issue that people move away, people change their phone number, you can't get in touch with them, whatever. But some basics would be just they start the study and they just find it boring and drop out. Or it could be they start the study and decide they don't want to answer the questions. It feels they want to protect their privacy and they drop out. But you can, those are two reasons you could use. You can also think about other reasons that someone might withdraw from your specific study. So that is the participant section. You go through and you talk, you say, again, as a reminder, you're not pretending that you've already got your people. Typically when you write this section, you would actually be writing, the average age was such and such with a range of this and a standard deviation of that. You would be reporting how many people were, identified in each racial group. But for this, you're just telling me, what are you going to measure? Remember, this is academic. You're never going to see something like this published in a journal. These are things that people write for their thesis, for their honors project, dissertation, or maybe for a grant proposal where they're saying, here's this project I want to do, please give me money to fund it. So this is going to look somewhat different than what you've seen before. I highly recommend checking out a few sample papers again to kind of see what it looks like written up. Let me actually bop over to... Oh, that's not going to be what I want it to be. Let me pull up the draft for this too. Because I want you to see what it's going to look like when you pull it into a paragraph. You're going to keep all the information in the same order. You're just going to smooth it out into paragraphs. Come on, internet. Don't be slow. I'm going to see if I can... yeah, this happened to me once before when I was recording, where Google Docs just would not cooperate. Let me see if I can get to it a different way. No, I don't have the draft written up here. All right. In the later videos, in the next video, I will pull this up. Usually it's the computer's just got too much going on with the video recording. So I will pull up the full draft. Yeah, nothing's coming up. I'll make sure that the draft is up and I'll show you what it looks like as a paragraph. But you can also look at it. It's not that hard. You're just pulling everything together in sentences. And so look at a few sample papers, look at the draft example, and just kind of fit your study around it. Thanks. Bye-bye.